what I see from your Whiteheadian work, Matt, is that in contrast to, let's say, Peter Rollins or even Zizek, kind of the apathetic theology, it seems so much of their theology is focused on negativity and probably makes sense given they're Hegelians, the negative aspects of God or like the self-divided God. Whereas I do see, and it's in many ways, in like our kind of like postmodern kind of culture, this is a breath of fresh air that Whitehead, he in fact, he asserts, he puts forward a positive philosophy through especially the ideas of like creativity and imagination, which is a big thing for you. So, uh, well, what really is that kind of positive orientation in Whiteheadian process theology, would you say, in contrast to more of the kind of the negative apathetic theology that we hear more from the Zizekians in our times?
Hmm. I think, it's very, I don't know if this is intentional on your part or if you know much about Schelling's positive philosophy, which was his late philosophical contribution at the University of Berlin after Hegel's death, where, and this connects to process theology and Whitehead's work as well, where Schelling basically looked back at his own earlier work and the work of Hegel and criticized it as a form of negative philosophy, which was merely conceptual. And if it were to have been more upfront about the fact that it's merely conceptual, it wouldn't be a problem. But he thinks, he's very critical in particular of Hegel's attempt to transition from the logic to the philosophy of nature, where there's this sense in which the logic just freely releases itself into actual existence. And, Schelling just didn't see how one could make that transition from the process of negation by which this dialectical logic could unfold to actual positive existence. And, Kierkegaard was at Schelling's late lectures, and many of Kierkegaard's critiques of Hegel come straight out of Schelling's late criticisms. And what Schelling wanted to offer as a remedy to this situation, because he admitted his own earlier philosophy was also a negative philosophy in the sense that it, you know, was relying too much on the conceptual activity of negation in an attempt to derive actual knowledge, where what Schelling wanted to seek in his late philosophy was a more existential relationship to actual existence, and to he called it a kind of metaphysical empiricism, where we're not so much concerned with what the structure, the conceptual structure of reality is. We're more concerned with the fact that anything exists at all. And he says that the fact that anything exists at all cannot be explained rationally, would be his claim, that there's something unprethinkable or unaprioriable about just the sheer fact of existence. And so, I mean, I think we can safely say that existentialism is kind of born in these late lectures of Schelling's. And, he also frames this as a kind of critique of feeling, Schelling does. And he says, he makes this interesting comment. I think I mentioned it in my book, about how, yeah, Kant tried to do in his third critique this examination, the transcendental examination of feeling and aesthesis and so on. But he didn't follow through fully, and he discovered things in that final critique of judgment, as I said earlier, about the living world, but also about aesthetics and our relationship to the sublime and so on, that in many ways undermine some of the systematic claims he made in his first critique. And so, Schelling just drops this hint about that we still need a critique of feeling. And Whitehead later in Process and Reality, I'm pretty sure, almost certain he didn't read these late lectures of Schelling's. I know he had read at least some excerpts of Schelling's in a book by a Russian philosopher named Lasky. So he was aware of Schelling, but he almost certainly didn't read these late lectures on positive philosophy. But Whitehead says, again, in response to Kant, that he wants to replace this critique of pure reason with a critique of pure feeling. And his whole process philosophy is an attempt to do so. And he also says, in the first critique of pure reason, Kant has these 20 pages on the transcendental aesthetic, where he, articulates his view of space and time as forms of our own intuition. And Whitehead says his whole book should have been about that, and not just this quick little 20-page aside.
You mentioned crossing the threshold.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and then basically Whitehead's philosophy of organism in the final interpretation ends up being a lot like absolute idealism, in terms of the relationship between God and the world, and the human self-consciousness and the divine. But he, as he himself puts it, he's putting philosophy on a realistic basis instead of an idealistic basis, because he's not doing philosophy in an attempt to build up this hierarchy of categories of thought, he says, but rather a hierarchy of feeling, and wants to root all of our human knowing, thinking, activity, and our knowledge in a kind of, I think of him as basically saying that knowledge itself is a form of feeling. Our conceptual activity, conceptual prehension in his terms, is a form of feeling, just we're feeling possibilities rather than feeling actualities. And so he wants to put reason and mind back in the world, back in the body, and put the body back in the context of a living universe. And so in this context, positive philosophy is another way of thinking about this recharged form of empiricism. Schelling called it metaphysical empiricism. William James, very influential for Whitehead, called it radical empiricism, where it's not that Whitehead wasn't aware of the importance of negation in the context of logical dialectics, but he accepts this pragmatist critique of idealistic philosophy and really wants our concepts to be adequate to experience and applicable to experience, and pragmatically useful. And like the test of any concept for Whitehead is, well, to what extent does it elucidate our experience, including our practical experience? So hopefully that gets at this question of the shift from the negative to the positive.
Most certainly does. And in fact, just to answer your question, Matt, whether I'm aware of Schelling's late lectures, the answer is no, because my only education of Schelling is from Frederick Beiser and this great guy on the internet called Footnotes to Plato. So I probably need to. Well, do you know what those lectures are called? Are they just called Schelling's late lectures, or
the grounding of positive philosophy? I mean, so
philosophy.
only some of those lectures have been translated up to this point into English. I don't know if you read German.
I know I don't.
I don't. I'm working on it, but I don't yet have the ability to really study the original. But SUNY, the State University of New York, has published a lot of Schelling's late lectures, and under the title "The Grounding of Positive Philosophy." Bruce Matthews is the translator. They've also, SUNY has published some of his philosophy of mythology. I think it's under the title "The Historical Critical Introduction to the Philosophy of Mythology." And so that's what's available in English at this point. Yeah, and these were all lectures he gave in the University of Berlin beginning in 1841, I believe. Yeah.
Excellent. If I could find that, I'll leave a link down below in the description.